No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 17. Cartagena, the final goal. In an age and area notably deficient in chivalry, Jean-Baptiste Ducasse, governor of Louis XIV's rowdy little enclave of Saint-Domingue, the western section of Hispaniola that had been taken by default from the Spanish, was a true cavalier. It was said of him that he was a tall, thin man who was gentle, polite, and respectful, and who was never false to himself. He was very obliging and had a good deal of wit, with a certain natural eloquence, and even as to matters outside his calling, pleasure and profit were to be had in hearing him expound. He loved the state, and good for the sake of good, which has become an extremely rare thing. Remarkably, this paragon of drawing-room virtues was a vastly ambitious fighting man as well. In fact, fighting and conquest were his life's work. Ducasse began his career in the perilous slave trade and left his lasting mark on the Spanish Main as a leader of buccaneers. Jean-Baptiste was born in 1646 near Bayonne in southern France. Although he himself never displayed the slightest interest in the church, Reformed or otherwise, his family was Huguenot, and Ducasse was thus barred from any preferment within Catholic France. Instead, he found employment with the Compagnie de Sénégal, an enterprise of private shareholders set up to exploit the resources of Africa's west coast, including, especially, human beings. When the Dutch-held island of Gorée, a slaving center off Dakar, fell to a French fleet in 1677, Ducasse, then 31, established his company's agents there and set about extending French interests in the area. In 1680, he sailed from Senegal across the Atlantic to Saint-Domingue with a shipload of slaves. There he encountered long-standing planters' complaints about the quality of the product furnished them by the Compagnie de Sénégal. Returning to France, he equipped a ship of his own, selected a prize lot of slaves in Africa, and journeyed back to Saint-Domingue, where he sold his cargoes to the planters' satisfaction and his own considerable profit. He used his earnings to fit out a privateer, and while sailing home to France, captured a large Dutch merchantman. He took care to divide his profits with the crown, which so pleased Louis XIV that the king overcame his religious bias to the extent of appointing Ducasse a lieutenant in the French navy. For almost a decade, sometimes under official orders, sometimes on his own, but always with at least the tacit approval of his monarch, Ducasse continued to enrich the coffers of Louis XIV by capturing English, Dutch, and Spanish merchantmen. Then, early in 1691, Ducasse learned that Saint-Domingue's governor, Tarin de Cussy, had been slain during a Spanish raid on the French holding. Ducasse immediately wrote to Count Pontchartrain, the French Minister of Marine, urging that French forces on Saint-Domingue be strengthened. In his letter he wrote, "The question of Saint-Domingue is the most important facing His Majesty outside his own kingdom, from the standpoint of the enterprises that can be fashioned there against Spain." The letter came to the attention of Louis XIV, and his eyes must have glittered when they saw the word enterprises, a long-standing euphemism carrying the promise of plunder. In the maelstrom of European politics, Spain, England, Holland, and Austria were now leagued against France in a war that was rapidly draining Louis's treasury down to its last reserves. The Sun King, as he styled himself, was almost bankrupt, and more eager for prize money than ever. Ducasse was forthwith given a frigate and 2 smaller ships, and ordered back to duty in the West Indies as Saint-Domingue's new governor. Ducasse was under no illusions about the character of the people he had to govern. Saint-Domingue, Ducasse wrote shortly after his arrival in 1691, was composed of the refuse of all the kingdom, men without honor and without virtue. That was not much of an exaggeration. Among the thousands of immigrants who had come to the island during the 3 previous decades, there were some honest, earnest settlers working to build a viable sugar and tobacco economy. But the place was as rough and lawless as any frontier society, filled largely with cheats, thieves, brawlers, and fortune-seekers of every description. With every man out for himself, there was little sense of community and even less of service toward the general common well-being. The local militia, in the opinion of Ducasse, was utterly hopeless. In actuality, the only real fighting men in the place were French buccaneers, who were content to tolerate the growing colonial enterprise so long as no one interfered with their pursuits. Previous French administrators, and now Ducasse, were happy to grant them status as privileged rogues. In return, the buccaneers agreed to serve the colony in time of danger, and help beat off the almost constant attempts by Spain to oust the French from Saint-Domingue. Once the buccaneers discovered that Ducasse was truly a man to be respected, and that he had aggressive intentions toward both the English and the Spanish, they accepted him, and only him, as their true commander. To Ducasse, the June 7, 1692 earthquake that leveled Port Royal and sent Henry Morgan's body to the sandy Caribbean bottom appeared a heaven-sent opportunity to bedevil the English. During the ensuing months, rarely a week went by without small parties of French buccaneers landing to harass Jamaica's shaken and enfeebled English colonists. In December 1693, Ducasse sent 170 buccaneers to raid St. David, near Port Royal. They pillaged the place and stole 370 slaves. The next April, a 400-man force set out in 6 small vessels. However, they thought better of the project upon sighting a British warship and decided, in the words of one of the observers, that they would only get broken bones from the venture. Nevertheless, 2 months later, Ducasse himself led 1,500 men in 22 ships against Jamaica. He had it in mind to seize the entire island and began by pillaging and burning in Jamaica's southeastern section, around Port Morant and Cow Bay. Sailing west, the French passed the devastated Port Royal and landed on the island's south-central coast at Carlisle Bay, where they remained for a month, burning 50 sugar plantations and capturing some 1,300 slaves. But then the English attacked with about 950 men, and Ducasse abandoned his plans to annex the island. Gathering up the booty he had already gotten, he and his band of buccaneers sailed back to Saint-Domingue. But hectoring the British, profitable and pleasurable as that pastime may have been, was far from being the summit of Ducasse's ambitions. His grandest project was to conquer the rest of Hispaniola, to fling the Spanish from their oldest possession and to rule it himself from the city of Santo Domingo. By the summer of 1696 he was ready to launch such a campaign. But then he received a distressing letter from his mentor, Pontchartrain, instructing him to call off his plan and to bide his time until the arrival of a certain Baron de Pointes. The Baron would be at the head of a powerful fleet, and Ducasse was to place himself at the nobleman's convenience. Ducasse immediately protested by return courier, but his pleas for independent command were only met by another disturbing letter, requiring him to round up all of his buccaneers and place them at Pointes's disposal. Born in 1645, Jean-Bernard Louis Deschamps, Baron de Pointes, was egotistical, arrogant, mulish, greedy, and, as it turned out, a cheat on the grand scale. But he was also a seaman of high order and a first-rate fighting man. An experienced naval officer, he had served well against the pirates who plagued the Barbary coast of the Mediterranean. Like Ducasse, Pointes had an ambitious goal, the conquest of Cartagena, the great wintering port for Spanish treasure galleons on the Main. He also had a detailed scheme for this project, one he evidently had stolen from its originator, an unfortunate Huguenot merchant, the Sieur Petit, who had been cast into the Bastille for his anti-Catholic activities. In happier days, Petit had dwelt and done business for a while in Cartagena. Seeking release from the Bastille, he produced details of the city's defenses and specific proposals for its capture. The fate of this Sieur Petit is unknown, but the Baron de Pointes somehow got wind of the project and adopted it as his own. He approached Louis XIV. If the king would lend him the ships and the men, then Pointes would undertake to storm Cartagena and return a handsome profit to the crown. To make the proposition even more attractive, all other expenses would be covered by public subscription, with investors receiving a share of the spoils. Since it would cost him so little, the Sun King was delighted to accept. The Baron fitted out a fleet of 9 heavily armed frigates, 4 lightly armed corvettes, and several transport vessels. Some 2,000 sailors and another 2,000 soldiers boarded the vessels, and the expedition got under way at Brest, on the Atlantic-washed tip of France's Finistère Peninsula. Because France was at war with England, a British blockading squadron under the command of Vice Admiral John Neville had been lying off Brest for some time. Pontus, flying his own admiral's flag from the frigate Scepter, made his break at dawn, January 7, 1697, and succeeded in sailing his fleet past the British with the loss of only one ship. Details of the escape are unclear, but outwitting Neville could scarcely have been difficult, judging from the Englishman's subsequent performance as he slogged across the Atlantic and throughout the Caribbean in unavailing pursuit. Held back by hard winds and stopped along the way for provisions, Pontus did not anchor at St. Domingue until the end of February. By then, some of the buccaneers whom Ducasse had dutifully assembled had wearied of waiting. They were restless men, and this was a season when Spanish galleons were under sail on the Main. Only 700 buccaneers remained, along with 170 colonists, and local militia, and a number of black slaves, bringing Ducasse's forces to about 1,000 men. These men Pontus proceeded immediately to alienate by announcing that they had to follow the same rules as any of the other men on the king's ships, and unless the buccaneers obeyed him, he would burn their ships without any regard to prior service. These buccaneers had sliced off men's ears with considerably less provocation, but Ducasse somehow managed to mollify them. Moreover, Ducasse loyally submitted to Pontus's insulting demand that he, the governor of St. Domingue, sail with the expedition not as a commander, but as a mere captain of a buccaneering ship. There was, however, one point on which Ducasse was adamant. The buccaneers must receive their legitimate share of all the booty. Since there was roughly one of Ducasse's men for every 4 of Pontus's regulars, the buccaneers would get 1/5 of the spoils to divide among themselves according to their custom. Pontus gave his word. Jean-Baptiste Ducasse and Baron de Pontus, Jean-Bernard Louis de Jans, were indeed a most peculiarly matched pair, and yet between them, despite dozens of disagreements and the venomous hatred with which they had come to regard one another, they would find both glory and gold in the last and perhaps the greatest exploit of the buccaneers in the Spanish Main. In late March, the French fleet, now boasting 7 buccaneer craft, 13 royal warships, and 6 to 10 smaller vessels, departed from St. Domingue and laid a course almost due south across the Caribbean to the coast of South America. The passage was uneventful, and about 2 weeks later, on April 13th, this powerful armada arrived off Cartagena, renowned as the Queen of the Indies. It required the merest glance at Cartagena's glowering fortifications for Pontus to see how inadequate the Sieur Petit's crude paper drawings were compared with the reality. The massive defenses before him had been building for nearly 150 years, ever since the 1560s. As the work progressed in the 1580s, the expenses of construction had become so great that, according to legend, Philip II once sat staring intently westward until a courtier inquired, "Why, my majesty, what are you looking for?" The reply came, "I am looking for the walls of Cartagena. They cost so much, they must be visible from here." The fortification of Cartagena had gained new urgency after 1586, when Francis Drake proved the defenses still inadequate by capturing the city. Now, a century later, as Pontus and Ducasse gazed at the stronghold that held the fabled riches of Potosi and gems from the Colombian highlands, they could begin to see how the Spanish engineers had skillfully imposed Cartagena's man-made defenses on the formidable impediments provided by nature. Cartagena was on the northwestern coast of the rounded top of South America, almost 200 miles northeast of the point where the continent is joined to Central America. The city lay at the north end of a deep-water bay, 9 miles long and 4 miles across at its broadest. It was sheltered by arms of land and open to the west. Resting squarely athwart the entrance of this natural harbor was a hilly and densely wooded island named Tierra Bomba. Originally, 2 narrow channels leading into the harbor, Boca Grande, or Big Mouth, to the north, and Boca Chica, Little Mouth, to the south, had flanked Tierra Bomba. When Drake conquered Cartagena, he anchored in the bay just inside Boca Grande, and there disembarked his troops for the short march along the Caribbean beaches to attack the city. Cartagena would not yield so easily to Ducasse and Pontus. In 11 years since Drake's raid, the city and the bay had been heavily fortified. Boca Grande had been filled in and now served as a causeway linking Tierra Bomba with the walled city. Thus, the only passage into the harbor was Boca Chica. But this opening was so narrow and shallow that Pontus wrote, "There's no sailing through it, but you must warp your ships along by their anchors and cables." That was hyperbole, Spanish vessels, including large treasure fleets, routinely passed in and out under sail. But Boca Chica was indisputably narrow, and the channel was treacherous for strange vessels without the benefit of local pilots. And its traverse had been rendered suicidal for an enemy by the construction of a Spanish stronghold, Fort St. Louis, on the southern side of Tierra Bamba, with 33 guns commanding the passage. Before Pontus and Ducas could hope to reach Boca Chica with their fleet, they would have to capture Fort San Luis. There were 4 more forts on the inner shores of the bay, and the walls of Cartagena itself were massive and studded with heavy cannon. Pontus was in a hurry, having it in mind that England's Admiral Neville would soon catch up with him. In fact, the hapless English pursuer was now only dawdling around Barbados, awaiting intelligence of Pontus's whereabouts. Studying the formidable defenses, Pontus at first decided not to force the harbor entrance, but to go ashore outside and attack Cartagena from the beaches, deploying Ducas's buccaneers in the van as shock troops. But the sea's bottom shelved so gradually as to make it impossible for ships to approach within cannon range of the city from the ocean side. Moreover, a giant surf built in the wide shallows, making it dangerous and exceedingly difficult to land even small boats. When Pontus and Ducas attempted to reconnoiter the beaches, their boat swamped in the surf and nearly capsized. Only by furious bailing and great good fortune were they able to get through the breakers again and escape. Obviously, this was not the way. Even the pig-headed Pontus was forced to conclude, as he later wrote, that the sea upon all the coast and all the seasons is a natural, invincible rampart. Cartagena is approachable only by the harbor. Noon of April 15th found Pontus anchored in deep water off Boca Chica, ready to launch his strike. Again, Ducas and his buccaneers were assigned to lead a landing party, although this time they were preceded by 80 black slaves who would spring any trap the Spanish might have laid. The landing force was to seize Fort St. Louis, which the French called Fort Boca Chica because of its position on Boca Chica. Ducas and the conscripted slaves, paddling light, shallow draft boats, slipped through Boca Chica, hugging the far shore and drawing no fire from the fort, and then landed in several places protected from the surf. Woods lay close to the shore, affording the Spaniards perfect cover for an ambush. But the way was clear, and soon Ducas raised a white flag as a signal for Pontus to send the rest of the French soldiers ashore. Then, while the slaves with machetes slashed a half-mile trail toward the rear of the fort, the fleet diverted the Spanish garrison with a bombardment. Surprisingly, considering the imposing look of the fort, the bombardment drew only desultory return fire. One reason was that the fort's guns were mounted on flimsy cedar carriages that kept breaking down. The French fleet only suffered a small amount of damage to the rigging, and only had 3 casualties. Pontus joined Ducas ashore and prowled the perimeter of Fort San Luis. Next day, entrenching equipment and some light artillery were landed. And in the afternoon, a Spanish vessel, sailing from Portobello and unaware of the dark events that were transpiring, arrived at Boca Chica and was captured. From a Franciscan monk on board came some disappointing news. The Spanish treasure galleons, which Pontus had hoped to find at Cartagena, were still at Portobello. Ducas, who was familiar with the Spanish schedules, had predicted as much, but had been scoffed at by Pontus. Nevertheless, the attack was to proceed. It was decided to use the Franciscan monk as a go-between to demand the surrender of the fort. To properly awe the friar for this mission, Pontus employed a ruse reminiscent of that used by Henry Morgan when he pretended to be sending men ashore at Maracaibo. Pontus paraded most of his 5,000 troops and buccaneers in a circle through the woods, so that the naive Franciscan was counting the same men a second and third time. Pontus later wrote of the friar's reaction that if the matter had depended only on him, the fort would have surrendered at that very instant. As it was, the attackers did vastly outnumber the defenders, and to a far greater degree than anyone on the French side might have imagined. In a sense, the very strength of Cartagena's outer works spelled the city's doom. So confident were the Spanish that a mere sight of the fortifications would discourage any invaders, that they neglected to provide the bastions with sufficient troops to man them effectively. Fort San Luis, for example, had a garrison of only 150. Despite the friar's tale of disparity in the numbers, the fort's commanders kept up a heavy, effective fire. As he was momentarily expecting a reinforcement of 300 men, he declined to surrender. But when the reinforcements arrived in 2 large boats from Cartagena, they met fierce resistance from the French troops and were finally put to flight by a wild machete charge from Ducas and his buccaneers. At that, the fort's flag was lowered, the gates were open, and Sancho Gimeno, who had been governor for above 25 years, came and delivered the keys to Pontus. The cost to the French had only been 50 men killed, but among the wounded was Ducasse, who had been struck in the thigh by a fragment of rock when a cannonball narrowly missed him. Pontus now held the key to Cartagena, but the door was still a long way from open. He knew that the citizens of Cartagena would flee into the interior with their valuables at the first sign of attack. Pontus meant to cut them off by sending a force inland to approach Cartagena from the rear, while he and his main force attacked from the harbor side. The inland expedition was a dirty job, and Pontus naturally assigned it to Ducasse's buccaneers, although Ducasse himself was down with his wound and unable to lead them. The buccaneers were accustomed to such work and didn't bother to bargain for better duties. The plan was set in motion, and Cartagena was in the grip of a daring pincer attack.